Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all. Welcome to the 20th. I think it's the 20th program in this Our America at a Crossroads virtual town hall series. Tonight, we continue presenting speakers of excellence by bringing you the most knowledgeable Ron Brownstein and, of course, the ever smart and thoughtful Warren Olney. Each week, we have hundreds of new audience members, and tonight is no different. We extend a special welcome to you. This America at a Crossroads series is jointly presented by Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc. I welcome you on behalf of the leadership of both organizations, Mel Levine, Zev Yaroslavsky, David Lehrer, Caroline Kelly, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and myself. Before we turn to tonight's program, I want to remind you that next week we will be addressing a topic which could not be more timely: voting by mail and voter suppression, with our very special guest, Secretary of State Alex Padilla, in conversation with our very own veteran of civic affairs, Zev Yaroslavsky. The following week, we will host Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, and the week after, Carl Bernstein. Remember, save all of your Wednesdays from 5 to 6 for the rest of this year. We also urge you to save October 22nd, which is the day after David Gergen will be joining us, and it's the day of the third presidential debate. We can't announce our special guest until next week, but we assure you, you will not want to miss this special Thursday program. It's going to start at 4:45 that Thursday, October 22nd, so that it ends in time for you to get something to eat and settle in front of your TV for the third presidential debate. Also, remember that we have a massive lineup for our pre-election 2-hour special from 5 to 7 on the Sunday before election night. In the emails I send you, there's a flyer at the very bottom. It looks like this, if you can see that. We have a fantastic lineup: Washington Post columnists Jennifer Rubin and Max Boot, Democratic consultant Bob Shrum, Republican consultant Mike Murphy, UCLA professor of American politics Lynn Vavreck, and the highly respected pollster Paul Maslin. It'll be a great evening, and we'll all be nervous the Sunday before the elections, so this will give you a great way to spend some time. And you could sign up tonight via the links that will be on the email that will be sent to you right after tonight's program. I want to take just a minute to give a special shout out to the extraordinary David Lehrer, founder and leader of Community Advocates and executive committee member of Judge and co-founder of this very special town hall series. Aside from all he does to help shape all aspects of this series, I want to call your attention to an outstanding article he wrote, which was published in the Forward this last week and will be reprinted in various newspapers around the country. It's called "Donald Trump is the Most Serious Threat to American Jewish Security in the Past Half Century." We have circulated a link to the article, and I'm going to circulate it again tonight. I really recommend that you all read it. Thank you, David, for all that you do and all that you write and all that you teach us. We thank our co-sponsors, Valley Beth Shalom, Temple Israel of Hollywood, Temple Isaiah, Ikar, Stephen Wise Temple, Temple Beth Am, Leo Beck Temple, The Forward, Jewish Center for Justice, and the Holocaust Museum, LA, formerly Los Angeles Holocaust Museum. Thanks for your donations and missives. We are a group of volunteers dedicated to bringing you these programs. We do everything related to these programs by ourselves. So do not be too harsh on us if we don't get our email formatting perfect, or if you think we send too many or too few emails. Believe me, we get complaints on both sides that we don't send the Zoom link out enough or we send it out too much. We're doing the best we can to bring you the highest quality programming possible. Expect imperfection from us, and you will sometimes be impressed that we get it right. But not to boast, but we think the perfection comes from our speakers and our moderators. And we hope you agree with the overriding value of these programs, which we work very hard to bring to you each week. Now I would like to hand off the program to a dear, dear friend, one of the great leaders of Los Angeles civic and Jewish communities. And by now, Zev, we can call you one of LA's patriarchs. I hope that doesn't offend you, but I hope it flatters you because it was intended to. Zev Yaroslavsky.
Thank you, Janice. And let me just say that in my book, you are the epitome of perfection, you and David Lehrer. Let me add my welcome to our incredible audience on another consequential day in American politics. There's never a dull moment, is there? Tonight, we're honored to have Ron Brownstein as our guest speaker. Ron is a senior editor for The Atlantic and senior political analyst at CNN. He writes a weekly column for each of them and is frequently seen on cable news networks. Ron has a long and distinguished journalistic career, coordinating political coverage for the Atlantic and the National Journal. He has been a regular columnist for the Los Angeles Times and has frequently appeared on Meet the Press, This Week with George Stephanopoulos, Face the Nation, PBS's NewsHour, and Washington Week in Review, among others. His work has been published in virtually every major publication in American journalism, and he has twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for his political coverage. In addition to all that, Ron has authored 6 books, and his 7th book, Rock on the Water, A History of Politics and Culture in LA in the 1970s, will be published and released early next year. I can't wait. Ron Brownstein is widely considered one of the most knowledgeable and influential journalists in our nation today. None other than President Bill Clinton, when asked to name the one journalist who generally gets it right and explains the issues, what the issues are, and what's going on in the country, responded that that person is Ron Brownstein. We are delighted that he has accepted our invitation to be with us tonight and to engage our guest in what will certainly be a scintillating and stimulating conversation. We are honored once again to welcome the legendary Warren Olney. Warren is the host and executive producer of To the Point and To the Point's Climate Change Update, podcasts based on his years of extensive experience as a journalist in print, commercial television, and public broadcasting. He formerly hosted KCRW's broadcast Which Way LA and the nationally syndicated To the Point. Warren is the recipient of nearly 40 national, regional, and local awards for broadcast excellence, from Emmys to Golden Mics, including the Radio and Television News Association's Lifetime Achievement Award. Warren, I turn it over to you and Ron for what I know will be a timely discussion.
Zev, many thanks to you, and thanks to Jews United and community advocates as well, and to you in the audience, welcome. In addition, we are so lucky to have Ron Brownstein on this day when the President of the United States, in his own voice, has been revealed in various in new and very interesting ways. I just would say with regard to Ron Brownstein that he and I have talked on the radio, we've talked on podcasts, we've talked in other ways and many, many times. And not only is he invariably getting it right, as President Clinton suggested, but he has a historical perspective and a clarity of thought and expression that I really appreciate, and I think everybody else does too. And Ron, greetings as always.
Hey Warren, so good to be here. So good to be with all of you and part of this incredible series. As you were going through the election eve, I was thinking I'd rather listen to them than me, but you got me tonight. So I'm happy to, if you don't have Lynn Vavreck yet and Paul Maslin, I'm happy to give you what I got. And it's really great to be with all of you.
Well, we're delighted to have you. And again, the topic is restoration, the struggle between America's past and future. But I think what we're really talking about is President Trump's past and future, and 18 taped interviews, hour-long interviews between February and July with President Trump in his own words. And what everybody is, I think everybody is certainly talking about it. The major emphasis has been on the fact that we now know when he knew about coronavirus and what he knew about it compared to what in fact he was telling the American people. So what I want to ask you first of all is, how badly do you think this is going to hurt him?
Well, by the way, first of all, as we'll discuss, you can't separate where President Trump is from the larger question of transformation and restoration and the fundamental dividing line in American politics about attitudes toward the way the country is changing, which I believe is the basic fault line between the two parties at this point. Look, this is, in conventional terms, and perhaps even in operational terms, it's devastating, particularly the February 7th. So far, who knows what else is in the book and what else Woodward is going to put out. The February 7th conversation in which the president says it's airborne, it's much more deadly than the flu. And obviously he was not saying anything like that for weeks and weeks and weeks after. And the governor of New Jersey already was on television today basically saying people died because the president kept that information. And obviously was not only sending out a different message, he was holding rallies, in-person large rallies after being aware that it was airborne. So then you ask the next question, okay, well, this is unquestionably horrible. There have been a lot of unquestionably horrible things. You know, my boss, Jeffrey Goldberg, revealed a bunch of them a few days ago about what he said about military veterans and active, you know, and his generals and so forth. And it sounds like there's some of that in the Woodward book as well. Does it matter? It does matter. But it doesn't matter perhaps in the way that people are kind of most visibly looking for. You know, there is a reason why, even before the pandemic broke out, that the president was underperforming any previous Republican nominee ever among college-educated white voters, even when the economy was roaring and all of them were sitting on 401ks that were getting bigger every day. It was because a lot of those voters viewed him as morally unfit and unstable and too volatile and too belligerent for the job, and someone who you couldn't trust. If you go back to last fall, which went, by the way, the presidential race, the head-to-head was incredibly similar to what it is today after all that we've been through. If you go back to last fall, Trump was losing a larger share of voters who said they were satisfied with the economy than any previous incumbent. Not close. There's never been anything. Roughly 20% of the people who said they approved of his handling of the economy still said they were voting for Biden. So what does that tell you? It tells you that if you know, Donald Trump at this point, somewhere like 42 or 43% of the electorate is with him. Could a few peel off from this? Possibly, but probably not that many. If you're still there, you know what you are getting in Donald Trump. You know you are getting, you know, someone who is kind of deficient on every measure of kind of human decency and is looking out for number one. And we'll come back to why they're still sticking with him. But the 42 or 43 is not quite enough for him to win. I mean, he's someone who has to add votes between now and then. And I think each one of these sequential revelations, whether it was the DHS Chief of Staff, Miles Taylor, whether it was Jeffrey's, reporting on military leaders, or whether it is this, it just says to that next group of voters who have rejected him largely on personal rather than policy grounds that they made the right call. So I think this is, I don't know if this peels away a lot of voters. Maybe this is the one that does. Probably not after everything else that's happened. But I think it is just, it reinforces that next circle of voters who we should be able to appeal to on both policy grounds of college, particularly college educated white voters that have rejected him on personal grounds. And I think this just reinforces their verdict.
You mentioned the economy. We, of course, talked about the COVID pandemic. What about Black Lives Matter? This is the era of Black Lives Matter, and there is an extraordinary exchange between Woodward and the president when Woodward says, essentially, what about our white privilege, yours and mine? And do we have a responsibility as a result of that? Do you feel any sense of that? And the president says, oh, you really bought you drank the Kool-Aid.
Drank the Kool-Aid. Look, you know, Donald Trump is running the most overtly racist campaign of any national figure since George Wallace in 1968. You know, this is where we kind of get to the larger transformation versus restoration point. You know, I have believed for the last decade that the fundamental dividing line in American politics are between the places and voters that are comfortable with the way the country is changing demographically, culturally, and even economically, and those who are uncomfortable with the way it is changing. And you have a Democratic coalition of transformation that is centered on the big metro areas and relies primarily on young voters, people of color, college-educated whites, and secular whites. And you have a Republican coalition of restoration that is centered outside of the metros, really now in every state, even in Texas, for example, or Georgia, and relies on rural, blue-collar, evangelical, and other white Christians. That pre-existed Trump. That basic dividing line pre-existed Trump. But what Trump has done is widen the trench and deepen the trench between those two Americas by taking everything that was kind of slightly below the surface and raising it right front center in the headlines. There is no way to avoid the overt racial signaling that he does every single day. And what he has done, I believe, Warren, is divide the electorate along a new cleavage that is slightly different than the one that we kind of think of in our memory. And what it's done is move more older blue collar and rural whites toward the Republican Party. And it's moved even more young people and college educated whites toward the Democratic Party. And so when he says something like that, he is reinforcing the lines that he has chosen to try to organize the electorate around. Not as severely as when he says very fine people on both sides, or when he tells Democratic women of color in the House to go back where they're from, which is like the South Bronx, the Bronx or Queens. But it is just kind of a reinforcement of the same thing. And the challenge he's got is that, there's no question that there is a bigger audience for overt racial resentment than many people, myself included, expected. It's definitely a little bit bigger than I thought it was. But it's not big enough, I do not believe, at this point. And the kind of the long-term challenge that Trump has imposed on his party with astonishingly little debate or resistance from other Republicans is that his electoral strategy is all about squeezing bigger margins out of groups that are shrinking at the price of alienating the groups that are growing, right? I mean, so he is strengthening the Republican Party with college-educated, evangelical, and rural whites, all of whom are shrinking as a share of the society inexorably. And he is driving away millennials who, with Generation Z this year, for the first time, people born after 1981 will equal those born before 64 as a share of eligible voters. By 2024, they will exceed them as a share of actual voters. Obviously, college-educated whites are increasing slightly, and people of color are increasing substantially. So I always ask the same question. Is there any business in the world that would operate on a business model that says we are going to dominate the markets that are shrinking at the price of writing off the markets that are growing? But that is what he is imposing on the party. It might work in 2020. We can talk about that. But as a long-term proposition, identifying with the racial resentments of the groups that are shrinking and are resentful in many respects precisely because they are shrinking is a very costly and short-term kind of strategy for the Republican Party.
Presuming that these differences between these groups aren't absolute.
Yes.
To what extent can he be effective? Is he being effective with, let us say, the white suburban college-educated people when he is able to emphasize and do so effectively in television commercials, particularly with the news video of the day?
Yes.
That there is, in fact, a tremendous amount of upheaval going on in the country, that there is destruction of property. I've talked to friends in Santa Monica who think they're having a great crime wave and that things are worse than they've ever been before, which is, I think, demonstrably untrue as far as I'm concerned. And nonetheless, that's where they're going.
Right. So obviously no group is absolute, right? That's the point. So, in 2016, if you look at 2016, Trump won about roughly just under 2/3 of whites without a college degree. Whites with a college degree, depending on the data source, either split evenly or broke very narrowly toward one or the other. 2/3 of Hispanics roughly voted for the Democrats, nearly 9 in 10 African Americans voted for the Democrats, and roughly 3 in 4 Asian Americans voted for the Democrat. That was the lineup in 2016. And if you want to add in, 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, and roughly 55 to 57% of young people, millennials, voted for Clinton. Okay, so where are we? What we saw in 2018 was an erosion for Trump on both fronts. He didn't run quite as well among non-college whites, even though he still did very well with them. Republicans didn't run quite as well with non-college whites. They still did very well. College whites moved toward voting majority Democrat for really the first time that we've seen in a House race. The votes among non-whites pretty much stayed the same, and the Democratic vote among young people rose back up to about 2-1, which is where Obama was in 2008. It would not shock me if the 2018 parameters are very close to what we see in 2020, with two big changes. One is that Trump, I think today, and we'll come back to your specific question, right now, Trump would perform worse among college-educated whites than Republicans did in 2018, and worse than any Republican nominee ever. Ever. I'll say that. Today, if the election was held today, he would lose college whites. First of all, no Democrat has won college whites in the history of polling, ever, unless you believe Clinton did in 2016, which some polls did have her winning. Some data sources did have her winning. He's on track to lose them by about 15, 16 points at this point, because not only is he getting pulverized among college-educated white women, which is something we have seen in the past, but he is really underperforming with men. And And then among his base of blue collar whites, he's still very strong. He's like at 60, 61% in different polls, state and national. He's just not back to that astonishingly high number of 2016, which was the best performance by anybody since Reagan. Now, I do think that the law and order message for Trump has some audience. In particular, it is probably helping him win back some very culturally conservative older whites who may have drifted away over his mishandling of the coronavirus. I mean, that is a natural audience to respond to this. And there may be some college educated white men who respond to it as well. But I think there is a fundamental difference in the electorate from when Richard Nixon used similar argument. Richard Nixon in 1968 is kind of the model, you know, the template that Trump has in his mind. When Nixon ran on law and order, most suburbanites thought he could deliver it. Now, white college voters are substantially divided, and at least half and maybe more of them think that Trump doesn't make them more safe, he makes them more vulnerable, because his belligerence and open racism increases the odds of kind of ongoing, you know, street confrontations that may ultimately reach them. There is not as big a consensus that the iron fist is the way to get all of this under control. And after starting off with some, you know, at least gestures toward the need for reform, Trump has jettisoned all of that. He's all crackdown, crackdown, crackdown. CBS national poll 3 days ago, they are all blurring together, but 60% of college educated whites and 60% of the country overall said the way to get this, to get more kind of peaceful streets is to deal with the underlying problem of racism and policeism. Only 25% said the answer is to crack down harder on protesters. So I think the circuit breaker on Trump's message is that there are fewer white voters than there were a generation ago who think that the Billy Club or, you know, the plexiglass shield alone is the solution to what they're seeing on TV.
Fox News tonight was very much emphasizing the resignation of a number of police chiefs around the country and of other police officers as well, and suggesting that the police officers, the law enforcement agencies of the country are so beleaguered that in fact we're going to be made unsafe because of that, and that we ought to be supportive, as every Democrat says, of course we should, except those very few who say defund the police, which of course Joe Biden has rejected completely. What about that? And does that have an appeal, or does that have a way of getting into that, group of people? You've got your hands together.
Well, no, I have this image in my head of like more chips on black, right? I mean, they have put all of their chips on, at this point, and I personally don't think they can sustain it all the way to election. They have put all of their chips on convincing the suburban housewives of America that they will be unsafe in Joe Biden's America. That they have put all their chips there. I mean, they're not out there in a systematic way saying, I can rebuild the economy better than Biden can. They are, you know, they are out there saying that I can keep you safe and he won't. And so, sure, Fox is, you know, part of that. I feel like we've been on this ride before. I mean, in 2017, Ed Gillespie ran on MS-13 is coming to kill you in Virginia, and he was annihilated in the Virginia suburbs of DC to an unprecedented extent and routed overall, even though he did great in rural parts that love that message. You know, the people who were furthest away from diversity responded the most to his attacks on immigrants. And in 2018, you know, Fox, all the chips were on the caravan, right? I mean, the caravan is coming to get you. There was a woman interviewed in the Washington Post who was a Fox watcher in Minnesota who said that she was so worried because all of the vacation homes on the Minnesota lakes were left empty in the winter. And what if the caravan came up and occupied them, and then you got back there in the summer and there was a family from Guatemala living in your cabin? Okay, she believed that, but they were annihilated in the Twin Cities suburbs and lost 2 House seats as well as the governorship. So I just don't think this moves enough voters in this era. You know, again, yes, can he make incremental gains with it? Possibly. But I think it is a very different environment where many more white people, especially college-educated white people, than in 1968 agree there is an underlying problem. There's no question on the polling on that, Warren. I mean, the share of whites who say that the police are biased against African Americans is vastly higher than it was in polling from a wide variety of organizations. And I think Trump, as often, is using a sledgehammer when he needs a scalpel. And there are just too many voters who feel either socially uncomfortable identifying with the overt racism that he's putting out, or genuinely believe that the overt racism he's putting out increases rather than diminishes the risk. That, he's putting out the fire with gasoline, as the saying goes.
I just want to make an aside to the audience. I told you this guy has historical perspective. He remembers all of these incidents, can bring them to bear in a very effective way to make the points that become unassailable once they have been uttered. I really admire, Ron, the way you're able to do that. Well, what about the impact of the lack of confidence in the electoral process and the way that Trump has tried very effectively, I think, to undermine that, whether it has to do with the mail and the nature of the post office or the fact of coronavirus? How many people do you think in groups that you would suspect would be supportive of Joe Biden is that likely to affect? And will they stay home? And will they be fearful of going to the poll? And what about the ultimate outcome of the election? To what extent has this undermined confidence in the very basic functioning of democracy?
So we can talk about that. I mean, I've actually been reporting out some of the nightmare scenarios with people who are spending their time studying it. Look, I think it's a fluid situation. In 2016, as you know, Warren, about 1/4 of both Democrats and Republicans voted by mail. It was about the same by party. And it was about 1/4 of all the votes. And I think about another 15% of the votes were cast early voting before Election Day. In the beginning of the pandemic, I think many experts expected, Charles Stewart at MIT and others, that we would rise to about 1 in 2 votes would be cast by mail in this election because people would want to vote by mail. Trump's fulminations against voting by mail, just made up and whatever, has clearly dissuaded Republicans to an extent that there's no question that many Republican state officials are a little uneasy. When you look at a state like Pennsylvania or North Carolina, and the disparity in who's requesting mail ballots is enormous. My gut tells me it's also going to dissuade Democrats, and that you are going to see people shift toward early voting rather than as many people who would have voted by mail. To begin with, even before any of this happened, before anybody heard the words coronavirus or, Donald Trump talked to China and learned about how dangerous this was, African-American voters in polling were much more skeptical of mail voting than early voting. There's always been a sense among many African-American voters that, like, I don't know what happens when I drop it off, and somebody may put it on a shelf. And so I remember talking to the kind of the voter outreach people at the North Carolina Democratic Party in the height of the pandemic in April, and they were like, we're not pushing everybody to vote by mail, because a lot of our Black voters would prefer to vote early. So if you ask me, I think we're going to see the balance is going to shift. Tom Bonnier of Target Smart, which is one of the major Democratic targeting firms, recently estimated that 75 million people will vote before Election Day, which would be about half of the total electorate. If we go all the way to 150, we had 138 in 2016. We could have 150 voting in 2020. My guess is that many Democrats, more Democrats than 2 months ago, end up either voting early or requesting a mail ballot and then returning it physically in person early or on Election Day. And, as the weeks go on, more Democrats are going to be worried about the red mirage. Now, that phrase refers to if, in fact, half or 60% of Democrats vote by mail and 80% of Trump voters vote in person. The phrase that people have applied to this is a red mirage. On Election Day, Trump could look like he's ahead because those votes are usually counted faster. And if he's ahead, that gives him a kind of a tactical advantage in trying to cut off the ballot counting. Whereas if he's behind on Election Day, I don't know what his play is, because, if you're behind, you can't really call for the ballot counting to be stopped because you're still behind. So I just think, obviously a lot of people are going to vote by mail. I don't think as many people are going to vote by mail as we thought a month ago.
One person we haven't talked about very much since we began is
Yes.
Joe Biden.
Yeah,
And
right.
I'm wondering,
Sort of representative of what's going on.
well,
Yes.
that's right. And that's pretty illustrative of what this election is about. And does it suggest that it really doesn't matter what Joe Biden does, or does he, in fact, have to get off it?
So I'm more in the it matters less. Obviously, it doesn't matter is too strong. I believe that races involving an incumbent president are less comparative than the incumbent president wants to believe, and they're more sequential. And by that, I mean that if you go back through history, there are very few people, relatively few voters, who disapprove of the incumbent president and vote for them anyway because they think the other guy is worse, or gal in Clinton. Well, I guess it was an open seat. Particularly when people are very unhappy with the incumbent's performance. If you go back to the 2012 exit poll, people who said they strongly disapproved of Obama's performance voted 97-1 for Romney. In 2004, people who strongly disapproved of W's performance voted 96-2 for Kerry. And Clinton was somewhere in the 90s in 96. I think that if people go through a two-step process in a race with an incumbent, do I want the incumbent reelected? Yes, no. If yes, I'm done. If no, I kind of take a look at the challenger and say, is the challenger acceptable? If yes, I'm done. I don't think there are that many voters who really conclude, and exit polling kind of points you in this direction. I mean, there just isn't that, and the ANAS polling, which goes back further, there aren't that many examples of people who say, I disapprove of the president and I'm still voting for him because the other guy is worse. The moment at which the challenger often has to pass that kind of quick glance hurdle is the first debate. Certainly it was true for Reagan in 80. It was true to a large extent for Clinton in 92. Quasi, the kind of Kennedy as the younger, lesser known challenger. Biden isn't lesser known, but he's kind of got the opposite problem. He's got to convince people he's up to the job. And I think if he convinces people he's up to the job in the first debate, he will solidify a lot of his voters. I don't know how much he can move things day to day. I mean, as I said, in a number of these polls, if you believe it's like a 7 or 8 point race, it doesn't look that different than before the pandemic, which is staggering, given everything that's happened in the country. I think Trump is going to run within a point, 2 at the most, above his approval rating. I don't think he's going to run much more than that. And the question, if you go back to 2016, he got 46% of the vote. If you look at 2018, Republicans in the House total, add up every vote in the country, got 45% of the vote. He's rarely had an approval rating over 45%. There is 55% of the country that from day one has not wanted this guy to be president, has not thought he is fit, not thought he is morally, deserving of that job. And the question has always been, can Democrats consolidate enough of them to beat him, especially given the inescapable reality that the last swing states that get you to 270, and maybe we'll talk about this in a minute, are more Republican than the country overall. I mean, it's just the reality. And so if Biden wins the popular vote by 2 or 3 points, he's in a real nail biter situation. Once it starts getting to 4, 5, and 6, I don't think the Electoral College can overcome that. So, he's got to kind of pass a minimum threshold, but he doesn't have to be Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or, Ronald Reagan.
Let's talk a little bit about the Electoral College. You mentioned earlier Texas and Georgia as places where things are a lot closer than you might think, even though they are, in fact, predominantly red states. What about Florida? The president was down there claiming that he's an environmentalist after all, because he's not going to go through with his threat to allow more oil drilling off the coast. They got mad at him in, I believe it was North Carolina. The governor there, the Democratic governor there, said, wait, the same thing is true here, but you're not doing the same thing. What about Florida?
Well, can I put Florida in the context of the whole?
Of course, sure.
Of the whole swing state map. The most important point to understand is that we pretty much now have the same politics in every state in the country. I mean, everywhere in the country, Democrats are getting stronger in the metros and Republicans are consolidating their hold over the non-metros. It is almost as if you could draw an imaginary beltway around every major metro in the country. And within that imaginary beltway, like the DC beltway, Democrats are improving their position. and Republicans are stronger outside of it. The challenge for Republicans is that Beltway is moving out a few miles every couple of years. You have to go further from the city center every 4 years to find the place where Republicans start winning. And that is now true in Atlanta, and it's true in Phoenix, and it's true in Houston and Dallas, just as it is true in New York and Chicago and Minneapolis. Now, having said that, there is still a difference of degree. And the fundamental tension in the electoral map at this point is that the evolution of the demography is more favorable for Democrats in the Sun Belt, but their ability to win white voters is still substantially greater in the Rust Belt. So if we think about the swing states in 2020, they now divide very evenly between the Rust Belt and Sun Belt. The 6 states that everybody, both sides agree, are the most contested are Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in the Rust Belt, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona in the Sun Belt. The next tier is that Democrats are contesting is Texas and Georgia in the Sun Belt, and Ohio and Iowa in the Rust Belt. And then for Trump, it's Minnesota in the Rust Belt and Nevada in the Sun Belt. So it's basically 6 and 6, 3 inner tier in the Rust Belt, 3. Okay. So within that, you look at it today, and somewhat surprisingly to many people, myself included, is that Biden is in a better position in all of the, if we just stick with the big 6 for a minute. Again, the big 6, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the 3 states Trump dislodged from the blue wall, coined by yours truly in 2009. I will take credit. I'm thinking about changing my Twitter handle to the cover of the article that coined the blue wall. And Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Biden's in better shape in all 3 of the Rust Belt states than he is in any of the Sun Belt states right now, which is a little surprising. He is in a very strong position in Michigan. Pennsylvania, most polls have him 8 or 9, although there are a couple that are closer. And Wisconsin is somewhere like 4, 5, or 6. He is probably 3, 4, or 5 points ahead in Arizona. He's somewhere around 3 points ahead in Florida. North Carolina, maybe 2 or 3. North Carolina is a dead heat. He's slightly behind in all likelihood in Arizona, in Texas, Georgia, Ohio, and Iowa. Now, so the shortest path for Biden back to 270 is just to win those 3 Rust Belt states. If he wins those 3 Rust Belt states, he holds all the Clinton states, fends off Trump in Nevada and Minnesota, he's at 270. If he wins Florida, obviously it's a death blow. What does Florida look like today? Florida is fascinating because, every candidate you get a mix of strengths and weaknesses. Biden's strength is that he is reassuring and he's okay for ordinarily Republican-leaning, both college-educated white men especially, and white seniors. So his weakness is he's not really great with young people, and he is underperforming with Hispanics pretty consistently around the country. So if you look at Florida, as I tweeted just before we went on, there are the last 3 statewide polls all have Biden only -15 with whites and at 50% or above with college-educated whites in Florida. That's really good. I mean, Hillary Clinton lost whites in Florida by 30 points. Andrew Gillum lost them by over 20. If Biden loses whites in Florida by 15 points, he should win the state. He might not win the state, theoretically, if his margin is diminished enough among Hispanics. There was one poll that had him only even with Florida Hispanics. Most others still have him up 15, which is not as good as it should be, but I think is plenty if he's only -15 with whites in Florida. And the reason he's only -15 with whites in Florida is mostly, again, because of those college-educated white voters who are moving away from Trump since 2016. Trump is still pulverizing him with the blue-collar whites, the rural whites, and he should be okay. I will say, however, and Warren, we've discussed this before, there is no amount of polling that will ever have Democrats completely comfortable about their position in the Electoral College for a good reason, which is that even if Biden holds all the Hillary states, even if he flips Michigan and Pennsylvania, he still has to win one more. And the one more is either Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, or North Carolina, or Georgia. And none of those are states that, no matter what the polls say, Democrats will ever go to bed feeling they are totally confident of winning.
Yeah.
So for people who are nervous about the election, just, it's an endemic condition. The funny thing is, Arizona of those is the one that I could most imagine Biden just kind of pulling away enough that people get a little calm about it. But none of those are states by history that Democrats can feel comfortable about. Florida always seems to find a way to slip away. It's Heartbreak Hill. Arizona, they've won once since Harry Truman. Wisconsin has more non-college whites than any other swing states, and North Carolina is tough. It's just very tough for them. So even if Biden is up 7 or 8 in national polling, that will almost certainly be enough to win. But I can imagine Democrats being nervous right up until and after Election Day, as we touched on a moment ago.
Yeah, after Election Day, as we're talking about, it is time for me to defer to the people who have been watching us both.
Okay.
And fortunately for me, Judy wants to ask exactly the question I was going to ask next time, which is, who's going to win the Senate?
So I think Democrats are favored to win the Senate at this point, but it's not guaranteed. Obviously, nothing is guaranteed in life. The larger, the big long-term trend is that we are seeing much greater alignment between the way states vote for president and the way they vote for the Senate. I think there are 24 states that have voted Democratic in most presidential races since '92, and the Democrats are 41-7 in those Senate seats at this point. And there are 26 states that have voted Republican mostly Republican since '92. And the Republicans have the vast majority of those Senate seats. I was trying to do the math really quick in my head. It would be 46 to 6. And in 2016, every single Senate race went the same way as the presidential race in that state for the first time ever since the direct election of senators in 1918. So that's the general trend. It may not be absolute this time. Democrats are virtually guaranteed to win Arizona and Colorado. I think they'll win Arizona regardless of whether Biden wins it narrowly or Trump wins it narrowly. North Carolina, Cal Cunningham has been consistently ahead of Tom Tillis, and he might be able to win even if Biden loses it narrowly. Conversely, Susan Collins might be able to win in Maine if Trump keeps the states close. If Trump loses by a lot, I don't see Susan Collins winning because she's not going to get nearly as many crossover voters as she did in the past. Democrats have very little chance in a presidential year of winning Alabama. So that's -1. They've got a net 4. Those are the big 4 that I just mentioned: Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine. The wild cards are Iowa and Montana. And I think Democrats have an excellent chance of winning Iowa, whether or not they win the state, as long as Biden keeps it close. Joni Ernst is more right than her kind of image. Her comments last week that doctors were making up coronavirus diagnoses to make more money was kind of QAnon craziness, and I think creates a real issue for her. And it's conceivable that Bullock could win in Montana if Biden stays close. It's also, I don't think it's conceivable that John Ossoff can win in Georgia if Biden loses the state, but it's not guaranteed that Biden's going to lose the state. And so there are a bunch of kind of pieces out there on the board, but I actually think Iowa is the best fallback for Democrats if any of the big 4 get away.
Martin wants to ask a question very relevant to this audience, and it is this: how do you think Biden will conduct policy towards Israel?
I think Biden will get along with Netanyahu as miserably as the last 2 Democratic presidents. I think it's going to be hard. I think Netanyahu has allied himself so unreservedly and openly with the Republican Party that it guarantees conflict with Democrats. I think he's mishandled this. He's kind of the Mark Zuckerberg of international relations, I mean, he's allied himself so hard with one side that it doesn't get easy if the other side wins. And so I think there would be a fair, I mean, Biden comes from the generation that is more deferential to Israel than kind of a modern generation of Democrats. And if you look at polling, there's been a real cost in what Netanyahu has done in terms of public opinion among Democrats about Israel. And I think it's been incredibly short-sighted and destructive. And Biden would be a moderating force on that because he, even more than Hillary, comes from a generation that sees that bond. But it is not going to be hugs and kisses.
Okay. Got a lot of good questions here. Let me choose Martin. Oh, no, excuse me. Martin's the one who wanted to know about foreign policy in Israel. Excuse me for that. Norman, could there be violence from either side after November 3rd? I think you might even ask the question about before November 3rd.
Both, I think, absolutely. Yeah, I do. Terrible to say, but yes. I have a piece coming out tomorrow talking about the plans on the left for massive demonstration if there is mobilization on the right to try to stop people. I mean, it's very easy to imagine that the same kind of people who showed up with Confederate flags and assault weapons outside the Michigan Capitol to protest the lockdown.
And inside the Michigan Capitol.
And inside the Michigan Capitol will be back to try to stop the counting of ballots after the election. And unlike 2000, when Al Gore specifically told Jesse Jackson to stand down and not organize public protests, it doesn't matter what Joe Biden says. There are going to be massive, I think, the largest street protests that America's ever seen. If there is a serious threat of, if it appears that Biden has won and Trump in some way is trying to overturn the result. And I think that it's also possible that Trump will deploy federal agents into major cities shortly before the election in some kind of disruptive way, a la Portland, to just try to mess things up in any, in any way that he can. So I think, yes, there is the possibility of violence. And, Trump has felt no consequences for going that far. I mean, there was the willingness of Republicans to kind of keep, as I like to say, every time he breaks a window, congressional Republicans sweep up the glass. And that's how you get to the point where the president can kind of praise people for driving through demonstrators and basically looking for a fight. That ended up, with one of them actually getting killed. So yeah, I think that is, and he probably views any violence, no matter who starts it, as good for him because it creates images of disorder that he can say he's coming in with the iron fist to cure.
David asks that there has been talk that if by Labor Day, the president hasn't narrowed the gap and doesn't appear to be doing any better than he is, will senators then who are up for re-election, some of the people, or some of the states anyway that you talked about before, begin to separate themselves from him in important ways? Is there any evidence? Of course, it hasn't. Labor Day was fairly recently, but has there any indication at all that that's going on?
No, and I don't rule it out. I mean, it will be very difficult. I mean, these, all of them have lashed themselves to Trump so unreservedly on repealing the ACA and voting for Kavanaugh and voting against removal from office or even sanction, defending him. I mean, what could Cory Gardner do at this point, or Martha McSally, even more to the point, that would, even Susan Collins, that would cause voters, 90% of the people who vote for Biden in every state are going to vote for the Democratic Senate candidate, and maybe more, maybe 93. So I don't see it. I mean, I think if you get past the first debate and he's still 10 points down, you might see some efforts in that area, but I don't think it's going to matter that much. I think the die is cast, and that they are very dependent. As I said, Collins, Cunningham, Kelly, maybe Greenfield, the Democrat in Iowa, they might be able to surmount Bullock a small deficit. But, if Trump loses Maine by 7 points, I'm going to go out on a limb and say Susan Collins is not coming back to the Senate.
John wants to know, what about the Russians and what they're doing to impact the elections? Do we know what it is, first of all, that they are doing? And secondly, is it going to be an impact? Is it going to have an impact?
I don't think we know what they're doing. So thus it's hard to say exactly what the impact is. I think the
we keep being told by intelligence officers, though, that they are doing something.
Yes, they are doing
entities that we're doing it, but what are they doing? We don't hear that.
No, but promote basically. I mean, the promoting rate. I mean, I think the understanding is they're trying to suppress African American votes primarily by promoting and encourage Trump country white voters by emphasizing racial division, which of course gives them the ancillary benefit of whatever happens, they're magnifying racial division. Look, if Trump has a pathway toward winning, and he does. I mean, I think there's no chance of him winning the Electoral College, as close to mathematical zero. I'm sorry, no chance of him winning the popular vote, close to mathematical zero as you can get. Can he get the popular vote close enough that he might be able to squeeze out those last couple of tough states, Florida, Arizona, Wisconsin, North Carolina? Yes. And the way he could do that is by turning out more of his voters than anybody is anticipating. It's hard to do in practice. We'll talk about that another time. It's hard to turn out your side because everything you do that is extreme enough to get people off their couch, everybody else hears, and there's a countervailing turnout. But yeah, that's the way he wins. And I think that, to the extent Russia is trying to inflame fears of kind of race war that gets some of his voters out of the deer stands, as someone said to me, it might be useful to him.
Trump, when he responds to the concern about raised by the Woodward revelations and what, or I'm sorry, they aren't the Woodward revelations, they're the Trump revelations.
Yeah, really.
About what he knew and when he knew it. He has been talking a lot about China and blaming China, as he's done so many times, for being responsible for this and being irresponsible for the fact that they allowed it to spread. How important is that? How important is foreign policy in general? And does that particular issue make it more important than it would be otherwise?
Well, I think China is, Warren, is less of a foreign policy issue than a cultural issue. As I said before, I believe the reason why Trump's 42 or 40 or whatever exactly it is sticks with him no matter what he does is because they view him as the human wall, literally the wall between them and all the changes in American life that scare them or that they feel marginalize them. Not every voter in his coalition, but I think, if you look at polling, for example, 2/3 of people who approve of Trump say discrimination against whites is as big a problem as discrimination against minorities. 63% have agreed that immigrants are invading American society. Comparable numbers say that Islamic values are incompatible with American values. And there would be similar numbers about China. So the idea that China is somehow conspiring to get us, is part of the same quilt that he weaves when he suggests that, AOC should go back as if she is a foreign force introduced into American life. The coalition of restoration is what holds together the Republican coalition at this point, more than anything else, more than economic issues, more than the role of government, more than tax cuts, more than opposing regulations. It is unease at cultural and racial change. Lynn Vavreck, who's coming, along with Brian Schaffner and others he's in Boston, they have shown unequivocally that the single best predictor of support for Trump in 2016 was not economic anxiety. It was the denial that racism exists, followed closely by the denial that sexism exists. And so I look at China in that context. It is part of his cultural message. And again, the audience for that cultural message is a little bigger than many people, and I will, myself included, imagined. But it is not quite big enough, and it does shrink every 4 years just from the underlying changes in who we are.
You talk a lot about polls, and obviously are very familiar with great numbers of them, and you compare them and contrast them. I can't remember who it was now. I think it was Phil, who wanted to know what polls are best.
Yeah. Well, first of all, just in terms of polls overall, as you know, there was a systemic problem in state polling in 2016, which goes to what we've discussed a few times, in that Trump turned out more non-college whites than any of those polls predicted. And as a result, they were underrepresented in the polls, and that flipped narrow leads for Biden in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin in the polls into actual victories for Trump, while the national polling was pretty similar. I think, probably the two best are the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, which are done by two professionals, Peter Hart on the Democratic side and Bill McIntyre on the Republican side. It's a little more favorable to Republicans than some of the other polls, but it's pretty rock solid. The ABC Washington Post poll is really, really good. The Monmouth poll has gotten a lot of respect.
What makes them good? Is it the size of the sample? Is it the scientific approach to this?
I think it's the
establishing of the sample.
It's the rigor of the sample.
Yeah.
It's the really trying really hard to have a sample that reflects what the electorate will be. That's the hardest thing for pollsters. It's not, they don't have that much trouble telling you how millennials will vote, or college whites, or non-college whites, or Hispanics, or Asian Americans, they have more trouble telling you what share of the electorate will be composed by each of those groups. So those are probably my two favorite polls. I think those are probably the ones that people look to the most.
We haven't talked about Kamala Harris, and Ivan wants to know, what is the impact of having her as the vice presidential nominee on the Democratic ticket?
You know, Warren, as you know, I am on tape in 2018, maybe 2017, as saying the best ticket for Democrats would be Biden and Harris, because it brings together the two dominant theories about how you beat Trump. One theory was, as embodied by Biden, reassurance. You want someone to reassure all of the traditionally right of center, Republican-leaning voters, white voters who can't abide Trump. That was theory one. Theory two was mobilization. You want someone to turn out the vast numbers of non-voting, non-white, people of color, primarily younger voters. And I thought that in the end, what probably made the most sense for them was to pick one from column A and one from column B. And that ticket always seemed to make the most sense to me. Harris wasn't as good a presidential candidate as I thought she'd be, made this kind of process a little more dicey. But it made sense in the end. And, you know, we're going to find out. I mean, Joe Biden is not going to be the person who solves the problem of inadequate turnout among young Black and Hispanic voters. It ain't going to happen. He's a 77-year-old white guy who in focus groups, many of those voters see as utterly disconnected from their lives, no matter how much they dislike Trump. And I think that Harris's success on the ticket will be measured primarily by whether she helps get those numbers back somewhere closer to 2012 than they were in 2016. She's also a value in solidifying that college-educated white woman position, but I think she has to do some heavy lifting among African-American young people in the Rust Belt. And if she can help at all among Hispanics in the Sun Belt, where Biden is underperforming, no question about it, in Florida, Texas, Arizona, you know, just a little, not a vast amount. Florida actually is a vast amount. Arizona and Texas is underperforming a little. They need something to get that, to feel safe about Arizona and have any kind of chance in Florida. They got to get those numbers a little better.
We just have a couple of minutes left, and I would like you to do this. The title of this was Restoration, the Struggle Between America's Past and Future. And I suggested that was the sort of title that would let us talk about anything, but you said that restoration is really an important issue.
Yeah.
You've used the term several times since then. So elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that.
Right. So in 2012, I wrote that the fundamental dividing line in American politics was between the places and people who are most comfortable with the way America is changing demographically, culturally, and economically, and those who are not. And I said it is the coalition of transformation and the coalition of restoration. That was basically what each side was mobilizing. I think it is much more true now than it was then. Trump has further sharpened and polarized this divide. In 2016, Trump lost 87 of the 100 largest counties in America by a combined 15 million votes. Those 100 counties alone, which by the way account for a majority of the GDP, provided more than half of all of Hillary Clinton's votes. But he won 2,600 of the other 3,000 counties, right? More than any candidate in either party since Ronald Reagan in '84. You know, I like to say he won every county in America with a cow in it. And I think in 2020, we will see this even more sharply delineated. I think we are at something of a battle of a bulge between what America has been and what it is becoming. I think Trump may not quite match his 2016 margins among his core groups of college whites, rural whites, and evangelical whites because they have been hit by the coronavirus too. But I still think he is going to put up towering numbers among those groups. I think on the other side, though, he is going to exile the Republican Party more than ever before from the fast-growing, diverse, secular, tolerant, info-age metros that really are America in the 21st century. It is a misnomer to say that people who live in LA live in the bubble. They live in America. White rural Kentucky is the bubble at this point. LA and Houston and Denver and Phoenix are closer to what America is, certainly to what it is becoming. And, you know, I often say American politics can be reduced to a single question. How long can Paducah tell Seattle what to do? And I think we will get an answer for that. I mean, the two sides are roughly equal in size at this point. I think the Metro Coalition of Transformation is clearly a little bit bigger. If Democrats win the popular vote, they will have won it in every election since '92 except one. That's never happened. No party has ever won 7 out of 8 since the formation of the modern party system. So it's clearly bigger, but the way the Electoral College works and the way the Senate works gives disproportionate influences to places that are least touched by this demographic change, and that gives an advantage to Republicans. But I do think that in this election, we will see the emerging America turn out in very big numbers to reject a kind of vision that, you know, talks about, again, that looks back for American greatness. And the only question is, can Trump squeeze out enough voters from his constituencies, which are stagnant or shrinking as a share of the population, to get through the Electoral College one more time? Right now, you'd say no, but you wouldn't rule it out.
As anticipated by Jews for Democracy and Justice and for community advocates, excuse me, you have done a fantastic job. I have learned a lot. I know everybody who is watching has as well. And don't forget, you mentioned LA, Rock Me on the Water. That's a book.
Yes.
It's going to be coming out. When is it going to come out?
Next spring. Next spring. It's,
okay.
It's a history of culture and politics in LA in the early 1970s. And basically, it's the story of how the 60s critique of American life was cemented into popular culture right here in LA, in movies, television, music, and even politics simultaneously.
Well, hopefully all of the things that you said before the election will still be true after the election. We'll find out, and look forward to talking to you about that, and of course about politics as well. Thanks so much for doing this, and on behalf of the both organizations and myself, it's been great to talk with you. Just want to remind people that next week, California Secretary of State Alex Padilla is going to be interviewed by Zev Yaroslavsky, the former supervisor, who of course is involved with Jews for Democracy and Justice. Zev Yaroslavsky will be doing that. Is voting by mail the answer to voting suppression? Very interesting question, very important. They're going to become more important as the days go on. Thank you so much. Great to have you.